A thick sheet of fog hung over Ponyville. The residents had been moving back into the city for a few hours, and an eerie silence had befell the land. In the quiet, seemingly empty city, Twilight Sparkle had gone over a small stone grave placed in front of her library. When Nightmare Moon had fainted, all the magic she had used dissipated, freeing Twilight from her spherical prison. She immediately ran over to Spike and tried to coax him back to life. In her mind, she couldn't believe that Spike was gone. On her way back home, she had carried Spike's dead body on her back, as if he were still alive. She talked to it as well. "How are you feeling?" she said through tears. The baby dragon on her back said nothing. It only lay stiffly against her skin. "I know you're sleepy, Spike. We'll be home soon." She had continued to walk, tears steadily rushing down her face. "You were brave back there, standing up to Nightmare Moon like that." She looked over at Spike's peaceful-looking body. "I just wanted to let you know, I'm proud of you. You're going to grow up to be a wonderful dragon." She began to sob profusely, knowing full well that Spike had drawn his last breath hours ago. She stopped and let her head hang low. "I'm sorry, Spike. I'm sorry." She managed to sputter out. She knew the truth. No one had hidden it from her but herself. And as she carried her dead friend on her back, she realized that. But as she stood in front of her deceased assistant, she simply couldn't bring herself to believe it. She stood silently over his grave, when through the fog, a black figure emerged. Twilight knew who it was, and launched herself at the figure, horn ablaze and hungry for revenge. "Nightmare Moon, you black-hearted, murderous piece of Twilight!" said a panicking white mare beneath her. Twilight looked down at the pony's eyes, realizing soon that it was just Rarity, dressed heavily in black for Spike's passing. Twilight backed away, her head down in sorrow once again, muttering an almost inaudible apology. Rarity picked herself up, and took a gentle look of concern on her face. "I know it's hard, Twilight." She put her hoof on the sulking Alicorn's shoulder. "I know that, in your heart, you'll never be able to truly let go." Rarity lit her horn a light teal, before a gold and red pendant gently floated around from her neck and onto the grave. Twilight immediately recognized it as Spike's fire ruby, the one he had given to Rarity a while back. It hung on the grave, slowly swinging in the wind. "But try not to linger too long, darling." Rarity then walked to the grave, looking at it gloomily, before kissing the surface and walking away, her silhouette against the sunrise. Applejack opened the door to her home, only to find Apple Bloom sitting on the couch, a hopeless look on her face. "Hey there, Apple Bloom," said the orange pony gingerly. Apple Bloom simply turned her head towards Applejack, her expression unchanged. Are you all right there, Sugar Cube?" "We almost died," she said solemnly. "Every pony almost died." She turned her head towards the window. "It makes me think about life. About time." She looked back over, the same lost expression on her face. "And just how little we both have." Applejack's ears flattened against her head, as she forced a smile to her lips. "Oh, don't look at it like that, Apple Bloom." "Why not?" she said quietly, her eyes looking sad and confused. "Why look at it any other way?" Applejack opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't think of an answer. Apple Bloom shook her head. "You know why? Because it's the truth. The outside world is ugly, dark, and full of sadness, and the life I've known has been so worry-free and careless." Apple Bloom suddenly looked frustrated. To look at it any other way would just be pretending it didn't exist. There was a long pause between the two sisters as they stared at each other. Finally, Apple Bloom's expression changed from that of a sad little filly. "I don't want to pretend anymore, sis." Applejack started to trot towards her, her sights set on comforting the small pony, but Apple Bloom only set out a hoof. "I need to be alone right now." She put her head down and closed her eyes. Applejack walked by her silently, before turning and heading upstairs. As she reached the top of the steps, she caught sight of Granny Smith. She was knocking on Big Mac's door, speaking softly and tenderly to the red stallion behind it. "Oh, come on out already, young man. The disaster's gone and past," she said gently through the door. "Nope," came Big Mac's panicked reply. "But everything's fine." "Nope," yelled Big Mac through the door, obviously frightened. Applejack let out a small puff of air through her nostrils. Even though Big Mac was a startlingly strong pony, he wasn't a very brave one. Applejack went inside of her room, a goofy but out-of-place smile on her lips. She knew it was over, and she was relieved that she and her family had arrived. But the emotional stress and trauma that it brought would remain as long as they all lived. She sincerely hoped that Apple Bloom cheered herself up soon. She wasn't sure she would be able to tolerate this new, grim little filly. Oh well. She stared out of the dim landscape, just as the sun began to poke its fiery head from behind the hills. She looked down on the landscape, noticing a large platoon of royal guards stationed outside of Ponyville, their heads raised and their horns ablazed. Why would the royal guards be moving the sun and not Celestia? Unless she had... Applejack reached up to grab her hat off her head, and when her hoof only felt her blonde mane, a shiver of fear crawled down her spine. Her hat was missing. Where could it have gone? She quickly recalled her parents' tree, and her returning the hat to her father. Now that she had noticed his absence, she couldn't help but be bothered by the sudden lightness of her head. She had grown quite accustomed to that Stetson, and without it, she just felt incomplete. The event had changed even her. She just sat there, running her hoof through her hair as she stared at the sun and watched it descend from beyond, rays of morning sunlight shining peacefully through her window. It really was a beautiful sunrise. Fluttershy sat quietly across from a royal blue unicorn. The Pegasus had found her perched uselessly in a cloud just above the Canterlot ruins. Seeing as Trixie had no wings, she gently pushed the cloud down to the ground, allowing her to escape the confines of the puffy prison and plant her hooves on the grass once again. She had been left stranded by Twilight after she dove after Nightmare with a potion and had been stuck on the cloud for several hours. Fluttershy had said her goodbyes to the Blue Magician before she asked to stay at her cottage. Trixie had been left homeless after an encounter with Timberwolves, and seeing as she had no place to stay, she obliged. Fluttershy wasn't entirely sure where Dash went, as she flew away a few moments after the moon began to rise. The yellow Pegasus had quietly objected, but Dash's mind had already been made. She had flown off to take care of what she called one last piece of business. Now Trixie sat awkwardly across from Fluttershy in her cottage, silently sipping a mug of cocoa, watching the yellow Pegasus as she meticulously catered to her small white bunny. She watched as Fluttershy rolled his white tail into hair curlers before turning around to prepare a large bowl of leaves, carrots, and other fruits and vegetables for the bunny. All the while, Angel sat and tapped his foot impatiently. "Thank you for letting me stay here, Fluttershy." "Oh, it's no problem at all," said the yellow Pegasus gently, as she laid the bowl in front of Angel, who began stuffing his face ungratefully. Trixie finished off the last drops of her cocoa before she stood from the table and walked to Fluttershy's green couch. Is it okay if I sleep here?" She motioned to the three-seater. "You can have my bedroom upstairs if you'd like." Trixie put on a gentle smile and thanked Fluttershy before retiring wearily to the bedroom. Fluttershy watched her as she disappeared up the staircase and heard the door gently close. She thought about what Dash would have meant by one last piece of business. "I wonder where that rainbow-maned daredevil has gone to this time," she thought, as she stared out of her circular window into the sunset. A small orange filly walked silently and alone down a dirt path just outside of Ponyville. She knew this dreaded walk all too well, but what she resented most was its destination, her home. She slowly approached her front door and lifted her hoof to turn the knob. She stopped as she realized it had been locked. She sighed as she lowered her head. She was hoping to slip in quietly, to try and avoid her mother's abusive gaze, but now she would have to be forced to knock on the door. She rapped against the cheap wood quietly, hoping to Celestia that her mother wasn't in a bad mood, but cringed slightly as she heard a pair of angry hooves storm the front door. There were several sounds of locks being undone before the door swung open to reveal a livid chestnut Pegasus. "Where have you been?" she screamed at her. "Oh, don't tell me. I already know. You were hanging out with that perverted Wonderbolt wannabe, sneaking in a few last-minute thrills before the—" Scootaloo suddenly raised her voice. "She's not a pervert!" Scootaloo stared daggers at his mom. "She's more of a mother than you've ever been." The chestnut pony's face contorted with hate, but she wound up and slapped Scootaloo to the ground. "Don't you ever raise your voice to me, you insolent little brat!" Scootaloo could only look up in fear as her mother berated her. She felt a bruise forming on her cheek, the pain swelling from the hit. The chestnut Pegasus raised her hoof for another attack, when suddenly there was a gust of wind and a cloud of dust. She saw her mother reel back in surprise, and could hear her coughing somewhere behind the smokescreen. The cloud slowly disappeared, revealing a rainbow-maned pony standing between Scootaloo and her mother. The chestnut pony could only stand in shock. Her body didn't even have time to process the event, and stood there, dumbstruck by Dash's sudden appearance. "Every last bruise," she stated, before she stood on her hind legs and pulled her hoof back, and then drove it into her brown cheek, fury and anger and righteousness flowing through her front leg. The force of the punch was brutal, and knocked the neglectful mother off of her feet and inside the house. The pony partially disappeared into the darkness of her home, before Dash turned around to Scootaloo, who only stared at Dash as if she was some sort of guardian angel. Dash walked over to the little filly, a sad expression on her face as she stared at the bruise. She could see it reddening and swelling, and let out a small pained whisper as she caressed Scootaloo's face. A tear began to form in her eye as she drew Scootaloo in for a close hug. She could feel the little orange filly's hooves wrap around her waist, and hear her head just under her neck. "I love you, Dash," said Scootaloo quietly. Her eyes closed as she held her. Dash only held onto Scootaloo tighter. She desperately wanted to take her away from this place as far as possible, but she couldn't do that. Not without the royal guards hunting her down and bringing her back. Not to mention, Dash would be locked away, giving her mother the last laugh. She could only hope that everything turned out all right for her, and do her best to comfort her when things got rough. Dash broke the hug as she looked directly into Scootaloo's eyes, the sunset reflecting in her pupils. "I love you too,"